Well, howdy, folks. Thank you for stopping by. This is a continuation of the Lone Star Ranger series, The Outlaw, Book 1 by Zane Grey. Sit back, relax, enjoy the ride. 2 days later, about the middle of the forenoon, Dwayne dragged the two horses up the last ascent of an exceedingly rough trail and found himself on top of the rim rock, with a beautiful green valley at his feet, the yellow sluggish Rio Grande shining in the sun and the great wild mountainous barren of Mexico stretching to the south. Dwayne had not fallen in with any travelers. He had taken the likeliest looking trail he had come across. Where it had led him, he had not the slightest idea, except that there was a river, and probably the enclosed valley was a retreat for some famous outlaw. No wonder outlaws were safe in that wild refuge. Dwayne had spent the last 2 days climbing the roughest and most difficult trail he'd ever seen. From the looks of the descent, he imagined the worst part of his travel was yet to come. Not improbably, it was 2,000 feet down to the river, the wedge-shaped valley, green with alfalfa and cottonwood, and nestling down amid the bare walls of the yellow rock, was a delight and a relief to his tired eyes. Eager to get down to a level and find a place to rest, Dwayne began the descent. The trail proved to be the kind that could not be descended slowly. He kept dodging rocks with the horses' looses behind him. In a short time he reached the valley, entering at the apex of the wedge. A stream of clear water tumbled out of the rocks here, and most of it ran into irrigation ditches. His horses drank thirstily, and he drank with that fullness and gratefulness common to the desert traveler finding sweet water. Then he mounted and rode down the valley, wondering what would be his reception. The valley was much larger than it appeared from the high elevation, well watered, green with grass and trees, and farmed evidently by good hands. It gave Dwayne considerable surprise. Horses and cattle were everywhere. Every clump of cottonwood surrounded a small adobe house. Dwayne saw Mexicans working in the fields and horsemen going to and fro. Presently he passed a house bigger than the others with a porch attached. A woman, young and pretty, he thought, watched him from the front door. No one else appeared to notice him. Presently the trail widened into a road and into a kind of square lined by a number of adobe and log buildings of the rudest structure. Within sight were horses, dogs, a couple of steers, Mexican women with children, and white men, all of whom appeared to be doing nothing. His advent created no interest until he rode up to the white men who were lolling in the shade of the house. This place evidently was a store and a saloon, and from the inside came a lazy hum of voices. As Dwayne reined to a halt, one of the loungers in the shade rose with a loud exclamation. "Bust me if that ain't Luke's hoss." The others accorded their interest, if not assent, by rising to advance toward Dwayne. "How about it, Euchre? Ain't that Luke's bay?" queried the first man. "Plain as your nose," replied the fellow called Euchre. "There ain't no doubt about it then," laughed another, "for Bossimer's nose is sure plain on the landscape." These men lined up before Dwayne as he coolly regarded them, and he thought he could have been recognized anywhere as desperados. The man called Bossimer, who had stepped forward, had a forbidding face which showed yellow eyes, an enormous nose, and skin the color of dust, with a thatch of sandy hair. "Stranger, who are you, and where in the hell did you get that bay?" he demanded. His yellow eyes took in Stephen's horse, and weapons hung on the saddle, and finally turned their glinting, hard light upward to Dwayne. Dwayne did not like that tone in which he had been addressed, and remained silent. At least half his mind seemed busy with a curious interest in regard to something that leaped inside him and made his breast feel tight. He recognized it as that strange emotion which had shot through him often as late, and which had decided him to go out to the meeting with Bain. Only now it was different, more powerful. "Stranger, who are you?" asked another man. Somewhat more civilly. My name's Dwayne, replied Dwayne curtly. And how'd you come by that hoss? Dwayne answered briefly, and his words were followed by a short silence, during which the men looked at him. Bossman began to twist the ends of his beard. Reckon he's dead all right, or nobody'd have his hoss and guns presently, said Euchre. Mr. Dwayne, began Bossman in a low, stinging tone, I happen to be Luke Stevens' side partner. Dwayne looked over from the dusty, worn-out boots to his slouchy sombrero. That look seemed to inflame Bossimer. And I want the hoss and them guns, he shouted. You or anybody else can have them for all I care. I just fetched them in. But the pack is mine, replied Dwayne. And say I befriended your pard. If you can't use a civil tongue, you better cinch it. Civil? Ha ha, rejoined the outlaw. I don't know you. How do you know you didn't plug Stevens and stole his hoss and just happened to stumble down here? You have to take my word, that's all, replied Dwayne sharply. I ain't taking your word, savvy yet? And I was Luke's pard. With that, Bossimer wheeled, and pushing his companion aside, he stamped into the saloon where his voice broke out into a roar. Dwayne dismounted and threw his bridle. Stranger, Bossimer is sure hot-headed, said the man, Euchre. He did not appear unfriendly, nor were the others hostile. At this juncture, several more outlaws crowded out the front door, and the one in the lead was a tall man of stalwart physique. His manner proclaimed him a leader. He had a long face, a flaming red beard, and clear, cold blue eyes that fixed in closely scrutiny upon Dwayne. He was not a Texan. In truth, Dwayne did not recognize one of them as a native to his state. I'm Bland, said the tall man authoritatively. Who are you, and what are you doing here? Dwayne looked at Bland as he added the others. This outlaw chief appeared to be reasonable, if he was not courteous. Dwayne told his story again, this time a little more in detail. I believe you, replied Bland at once. Think I know when a fellow's lying. I reckon you're on the right trail. Put in, Euchre. That about Luke wanting his boots took off, that satisfies me. Luke had a mortal dread of dying with his boots on. At this, Sally, the chief, and his men laughed. You said Dwayne? Buck Dwayne? Queried Bland. Are you son of that Dwayne who was a gunfighter some years back? Yes, replied Dwayne. Never met him. Glad I didn't, said Bland, with a grim humor. So you got in trouble and had to go on the dodge? What kind of trouble? Had a fight. Fight? Do you mean gunplay? Questioned Bland. He seemed eager, curious, speculative. Yes, it ended in gunplay, I'm sorry to say, answered Dwayne. Guess I'd need Nassau son of Dwayne if he killed his man, went on Bland ironically. Well, I'm sorry you bucked against trouble in my camp, but as it is, I guess you'd be wise to make yourself scarce. Do you mean I'm politely being told to move on? Asked Dwayne quietly. Not exactly that, said Bland, as if irritated. If this isn't a free place, there isn't one on earth. Every man's equal here. You want to join my band? No, I don't. Well, even if you did, imagine that wouldn't stop Bossimer. He's an ugly fella. He's one of the few gunmen I've met who wants to kill somebody all the time. Most men like that are four flushes. But Bossimer is all one color, and that's red. Merely for your own sake, I advise you hit the trail. Thanks, but if that's all, I'll stay, returned Dwayne. Even as he spoke, he felt that he did not know himself. Bossimer appeared at the door, pushing men who tried to detain him, and as he jumped clear of the last reaching hand, uttered a snarl like an angry dog. Manifestly, the short while he had spent inside the saloon had been devoted to drinking and talk himself into a frenzy. Bland and the other outlaws quickly moved outside, letting Dwayne stand alone. When Bossimer saw Dwayne standing motionless and watchful, a strange change passed quickly in him. He halted in his tracks, and as he did that, the men who followed him piled out one over the other in a hurry to get to one side. Dwayne saw the swift action, felt intuitively the meaning of it, and Bossimer's sudden change of front. The outlaw was keen, and he had expected a shrinking or at least a frightened antagonist. Dwayne knew he was neither. He felt like iron, and yet thrill after thrill ran through him. It was almost as if the situation had been one long familiar to him. Somehow he understood this yellow-eyed Bossimer. The outlaw had come out to kill him, and now, though somewhat checked by the stand of a stranger, he still meant to kill. Like so many desperados of his ilk, he was a victim of passion to kill for the sake of killing. Dwayne divined that no sudden animosity was driving Bossimer. It was just his chance. In that moment, murder would have been joy to him. Very likely he had forgotten his pretext for a quarrel. Very probably his faculties were absorbed in conjecture as to Dwayne's possibilities. But he did not speak a word. He remained motionless for a long moment, his eyes pale and steady, his right hand like a claw. The instant gave Dwayne a power to read the enemy's eyes, the thought that preceded action. But Dwayne did not want to kill another man. Still, he'd have to fight, and he decided to cripple Bossimer. When Bossimer's hand moved, Dwayne's gun was spouting fire. 2 shots only, both from Dwayne's gun. The outlaw fell with his right arm shattered. Bossimer cursed harshly and floundered in the dust, trying to reach the gun with his left hand. His comrades, however, seeing that Dwayne would not kill unless forced, closed in on Bossimer and prevented any further madness on his part. Of the outlaws present, Euchre appeared to be the one most inclined to lend friendliness to curiosity, and he led Dwayne and the horses away to a small adobe shack. He tied the horses in an open shed and removed their saddles. Then, gathering up Stephen's weapons, he invited his visitor to enter the house. It had 2 rooms, windows without coverings, bare floors. One room contained blankets, weapons, saddles, and bridles, and the other a stone fireplace, rude table and a bench, 2 bunks, a box cupboard, and various blackened utensils. "Make yourself to home as long as you want to stay," said Euchre. "I ain't rich in this world's goods, but I own what's here, and you're welcome to it." "Thanks. I'll stay a while and rest. I'm pretty well played out," replied Dwayne. Euchre gave him a keen glance. "Go ahead and rest. I'll take your hosses to grass." Euchre left Dwayne alone in the house. Dwayne relaxed then, and mechanically he wiped the sweat from his face. He was laboring under some kind of spell or shock which did not pass off quickly. When it had worn away, he took off his coat and belt and made himself comfortable on the blankets. And he had a thought that if he rested or slept, what a difference would that make tomorrow? No rest, no sleep could change the gray outlook of the future. He felt glad when Euchre came bustling in, and for the first time he took notice of this outlaw. Euchre was old in years. What little hair he had was gray, his face clean-shaven and full of wrinkles. His eyes were half shut from long gazing into the sun and dust. He stooped, but his thin frame denoted strength and endurance still unimpaired. "Hey, you want to drink or smoke?" he asked. Dwayne shook his head. He had not been unfamiliar with whiskey, and he used tobacco moderately since he was 16. But now, strangely, he felt a disgust at the idea of stimulants. He did not understand clearly what he felt. There was a vague idea of something wild in his blood, something that made him fear himself. Euchre wagged his old head sympathetically. "Reckon you feel a little sick. When it comes to shooting, I run. What's your age?" 23, replied Dwayne. Euchre showed surprise. "Damn, you only a boy. I thought you 30 anyways. Buck, I heard what you told Bland, and putting that with my own figuring, I reckon you're no criminal yet. Throwing a gun in self-defense, that ain't no crime." Dwayne, finding relief in talking, told more about himself. "Huh," replied the old man. "I've been on this river for years. I've seen hundreds of boys come in the dodge. Most of them, though, was no good, and that kind don't last long. This river country has been and is refuge for criminals from all over the states. I've been bunked with bank cashiers, forgers, plain thieves, and out-and-out murderers. all of which had no business on the Texas border. Fellers like Bland are exceptions. He's no Texans. You've seen that. The gang rules here. Come from all over, and they're tough cusses. You can bet on that. They live fat and easy. If it wasn't for the fighting among themselves, they sure grow populous. The Rimrock is no place for a peaceable, decent feller. I heard you tell Bland you wouldn't join his gang. That'll not make him take a liking to you. You got any money? Not much, replied Dwayne. Could you live by gambling? Are you any good at the cards? No. You wouldn't steal horses or rustle cattle? No. When your money's gone, how the hell you gonna live? There ain't any work for a decent feller could do round here. You can't herd with the greases. Why, Bland's men would shoot you in the fields. What do you do, son? God knows, replied Dwayne hopelessly. I'll make my money last as long as possible and then starve. Well, I'm pretty poor, but you'll never starve while I got some. Here it struck Dwayne again, that something human and kind and eager which he had seen in Stevens. Dwayne's estimate of outlaws had lacked this quality. He had not accorded them any virtues. To him, as to the outside world, they had been merely vicious men with one redeeming feature. I'm much obliged to you, Euchre, replied Dwayne. But of course I won't live with anyone unless I can pay my share. Have it the way you like, my son, Euchre good-humoredly. You make a fire and I'll set out to getting some grub. I'm a sourdough, Buck. That man doesn't live who can't beat my bread. How do you ever pack supplies in here? Asked Dwayne, thinking of the most inaccessible nature of this valley. Some comes across from Mexico, and the rest down river. The river trip is a bird. It's more than 500 miles to any supply point. Bland has mozos, greaser boatmen. Sometimes, too, he gets supplies in from downriver. You see, Bland sells thousands of cattle in Cuba, and all this stock has to go down by boat to meet the ships. Where on earth are the cattle driven down to the river? Asked Dwayne. That's not my secret, replied Euclid shortly. Fact is, I don't know. I've rustled cattle for Bland, but he never sent me through the Rimrock with him. Dwayne experienced a sort of pleasure in the realization that interest had been stirred in him. He was curious about Bland and his gang, and glad to have something to think about. Every once in a while he had a sensation that was almost like a pang. He wanted to forget. In the next hour he did forget, and enjoyed helping in preparation of eating of the meal. Euchre, after washing and hanging up several utensils, put on his hat and turned to go out. Come along or stay here, as you want, said Dwayne. I'll stay, rejoined Dwayne slowly. The outlaw left the room and trudged away, whistling cheerfully. Dwayne looked around him for a book or paper or anything to read, but all the printed matter he could find consisted of a few words on cartridge boxes and an advertisement on the back of a tobacco pouch. There seemed to be nothing for him to do. He had rested. He did not want to lie down any more. He began to walk to and fro, from one end of the room to the other. And as he walked, he fell into lately acquired habit of brooding over his misfortune. Suddenly he straightened up with a jerk. Unconsciously had drawn his gun. Standing there with a bright cold weapon in his hand, he looked at it in consternation. How had he come to draw it? With difficulty he traced his thoughts backward, but could not find any that were accountable for this act. He discovered, however, that he had remarkable tendency to drop his hand to his gun. That might come from habit and long practice in drawing and giving him. Likewise, it might have come from subtle sense, scarcely thought of at all, of the late, close, and inevitable relationship between that weapon and himself. He was amazed to find that, bitter as he had grown at fate, the desire to live burned strong in him. If he had been as unfortunately situated But the difference that no man wanted to put him in jail or take his life, he felt that this burning passion to be free, to save himself, might not have been so powerful. Life certainly held no bright prospects for him. Already he had begun to despair of getting back to his home, but to give up like a white-hearted coward, to let himself be handcuffed in jail, to run from drunken, bragging cowboy, or be shot in cold blood by some border brute who merely wanted to add another notch to his gun, these things were impossible for Dwayne because there was in him the temper to fight. In that hour he yielded only to fate and spirit inborn in him. Hereafter his gun must be a living part of him. Right then and there he returned to practice. He had long discontinued the draw. It was now a stern, bitter, deadly business with him, and he did not need to fire the gun for accuracy. That was a gift he'd become assured with. Swiftness on the draw, however, could be improved, and he set himself to acquire a limit of speed barely possible to any man. He stood still in his track. He paced the room. He sat down, he lay down, he put himself in awkward positions, and from every position he practiced throwing his gun. Practiced it until he was hot and tired and his arm ached and his hand burned. The practice he determined to keep up every day. It was one thing at least that would help him pass the weary hours. Later he went outdoors to the cooler shade of the cottonwoods. From this point he could see a good deal of the valley. Under different circumstances, Dwayne felt that he would have enjoyed such a beautiful spot. Euchre's shack sat against the first rise of the slope of the wall, and Dwayne, by climbing a few rods, got a view of the whole valley. Assuredly it was an outlaw settle-meet. He saw a good many Mexicans who, of course, were hand in glove with Bland. Also, he saw some enormous flatboats, crude of structure, moored along the banks of the river. The Rio Grande rolled away between the high bluffs. A cable sagging deep in the middle was stretched over the wide yellow stream, and an old scow, evidently used as a ferry, lay anchored on the far shore. The valley was an ideal retreat for an outlaw band operating on a big scale. Pursuit scarcely need be feared over the broken trails of the rim rock. In the open end of the valley could be defended against almost any number of men coming down river. Access to Mexico was easy and quick. What puzzled Dwayne was how Bland got cattle down to the river, and he wondered if the rustler did get rid of his stolen stock by use of boats. Dwayne must have idled considerable time up on the hill, for when he returned to the shack, Euchre was busily engaged around the campfire. "Well, glad to see you ain't pale about the gills as you was," he said, by way of greeting. "Pitch in and we'll have grub ready soon. There's sure one consoling fact round here in camp." "What's that?" asked Dwayne. "Plenty of good, juicy beef to eat, and it doesn't cost a short bit. But it costs hard rides and trouble, bad conscience, and life too, doesn't it?" "I ain't sure about the bad conscience. Mine never bothered me none. And as for life, why, that's cheap in Texas." "Who is Bland?" asked Dwayne quickly, changing the subject. "What do you know about him?" "We don't know who he is or where he hails from," replied Euchre. "That's always been something of interest in the gang. He must have been a young man when he struck Texas. Now he's middle-aged. I remember how years ago he was soft-spoken and not rough in talk or act like he is now. Bland ain't likely his name. He knows a lot. He can doctor, too, and he's sure a known feller with tools. He's the kind that rules men. Outlaw's always riding in here to join his gang, and if it hadn't been for the gambling and gunplay, we'd probably have 1,000 men around him. How many in his gang now?" "I reckon there's just short of 100. Number varies, and Bland has very small camps up and down the river. Also, he has men back on the cattle ranges." "How does he control such a big force?" asked Dwayne. "Especially when his band's composed of bad men. Luke Stevens said he had no use for Bland, and I heard once somewhere that Bland was the devil." "That's it. He's the devil. He's hard as flint, violent in temper, never made any friends except his right-hand man. Dave Rugg and Chess Alloway, Bland shoot you at a wink. He's killed a lot of fellers, and some for nothing. The reason the outlaws gather around and stick in is because safe refuge. And then he's well heeled. Bland's rich. They say he has 100,000 pesos hid somewhere and lots of gold, but he's free with money. He gambles when he's not off with a shipment of cattle. He throws money around. And the fact is, there's plenty of money where he is. That's what holds the gang. Dirty, bloody money. It's a wonder he hasn't been killed all these years on the border, exclaimed Dwayne. Well, replied Euchre drearily, he's been quicker on the draw than the other fellers who hankered to kill him, that's all. Euchre's reply rather chilled Dwayne's interest for the moment. Such remarks always made his mind revolve around facts pertaining to himself. Speaking of this here swift wrist game, went on Euchre, there's been considerable talk in camp about your throwing of a gun. You know, Buck, that among us fellers, us hunted men, there ain't nothing calculated to rouse respect like a slick hand with a gun. I heard Bland say this afternoon, and he said it serious-like and speculative, that he'd never seen your equal. He was watching of you close, and he said he just couldn't follow your hand when you drawed. All the fellers who seen you meet Bossimer had something to say. Bo was about as handy with a gun as any man in this camp, barring Chess Alloway and maybe Bland himself. Chess is captain with a cold, or he was, and he sure didn't like the references made about your speed. Bland was honest and acknowledgent, but he didn't like it neither. Some of the fellers allowed you to draw might have been just by accident, but most of them figured different, and they all shut up when Bland told who and what your dad was. 'Pears to me I once seen your dad in a gun scrape over at Santone years ago. Well, put my oar in today among the fellers, and I say, what ails you, locoed gents? Did young Dwayne budge an inch when Bo came roaring out, blood in his eye? Wasn't he cool and quiet, steady of lips? Weren't his eyes reading Bo's mind? And that lightning draw, can't you all see that's family? Euchre's narrow eyes twinkled, and he gave the dough he was rolling a slap with his flower-whitened hand. Manifestly he proclaimed himself a champion and partner of Dwayne's with all the pride an old man could feel for the young one whom he admired. Well, he resumed presently, that's your introduction to the border, Buck, and your card was a high trump. You'll be let severely alone by real gunfighters and men like Bland, Holloway, Rugg, and the bosses of the other gangs. After all, these real men are men, you know, and unless you cross them, they're no more likely to interfere with you than you are with them. But there's a sight of fellers like Bossimer in the river country. They all want your game, and every town you ride into will scare up some cowpuncher full of booze, or long-haired four-flush gunman, or a sheriff, and these men will be playing the crowd and yelling for your blood. That's the Texas of it. You'll have to hide forever in the breaks, or you'll have to kill such men. Buck, I reckon this ain't cheerful news to a decent chap like you. I'm only telling you 'cause I'm taking a liking to you, and I've seen right off that you ain't border-wise. Let's eat now. Afterward we'll go out so the gang can see you're not hiding. When Dwayne went out with Euchre, the sun was setting behind the blue range of the mountains across the river in Mexico. The valley appeared to be open to the southwest. It was tranquil, beautiful scene. Somewhere in the house near at hand, a woman was singing, and in the road Dwayne saw a little Mexican boy driving home some cows, one of which wore a bell. The sweet, happy voice of a woman and a whistling barefoot boy seemed utterly out of place here. Euchre presently led to the square in a row of rough houses Dwayne remembered. He almost stepped on a wide imprint in the dust where Bossimer had confronted him, and a sudden fury beset him that he should be affected strangely by the sight of it. "Let's have a look here," said Euchre. Dwayne had to bend his head to enter the door, and found himself in a very large room enclosed by adobe walls and roofed with brush. It was full of rude benches, tables, seats. At one corner, a number of kegs and barrels lay side by side in a rack. A Mexican boy was lighting lamps hung on posts that sustained the log rafters on the roof. "Only feller who's going to put in a close eye on you is Benson," said Euchre. "He runs the place and sells drinks. The gang calls him Jackrabbit Benson, because he's always got his eye peeled and his ear cocked. Don't notice him if he looks you over, Buck. Benson is scared to death of every newcomer who rustles into Bland's camp. And the reason, I take it, is because he's done somebody dirt. He's hiding, not from a sheriff or a ranger. Men who hide from them don't act like Jackrabbit Benson. He's hiding from some guy who's hunting him to kill him. Well, I'm always expecting to see some fellow ride in here and throw a gun on Benson. Can't say I'd be grieved. Dwayne casually glanced in the direction indicated, and he saw a spare, gaunt man with face strikingly white beside the red and bronze and dark skins of men around him. It was a cadaverous face. The black mustang hung down, a heavy lock of black hair dropped down over the brow. Deep-set, hollow, staring eyes looked out piercingly. The man had a restless, alert, nervous manner. He put his hands on the board and served as a bar and stared at Dwayne. But when he met Dwayne's glance, he turned hurriedly to go on serving out liquor. "What do you got against him?" inquired Dwayne, as he sat down beside Euchre. He asked more for something to say than from real interest. "What do you care about mean-haunted, craven-faced criminal?" "Well, maybe I'm cross-grained," replied Euchre apologetically. "Sure, an outlaw and a rustler such as me can't be touchy. But I never stole nothing but cattle from some rancher who never missed 'em anyway. That sneak Benson, he was the means of putting a little girl in Bland's way." "Girl?" queried Dwayne, now with real attention. "Sure. Bland's great on women. I'll tell you about this girl when we get out of here. Some of the gang are going to be sociable, and I can't talk about the chief." During the ensuing half hour, a number of outlaws passed by Dwayne and Euchre, halted for a greeting or sat down for a moment. They were all guff, loud-voiced, merry, and good-natured. Dwayne replied civilly and agreeably and when he was personally addressed, but he refused all invitations to drink and gamble. Evidently, he'd been accepted in a way as one of their clan. No one made any hint of an allusion to his affair with Bosmer. Dwayne saw readily that Euchre was well liked. One outlaw borrowed money from him, another asked for tobacco. By the time it was dark, the big room was full of outlaws and Mexicans, most of whom were engaged at monte. These gamblers, especially the Mexicans, were intense and quiet. The noise in the place came from the drinkers and the loungers. Dwayne had seen gambling resorts, some of the famous ones in San Antonio and El Paso. Few in border towns were licensed and unchecked, but this place of Jackrabbit Benson's impressed him as one where guns and knives are accessories to the game. To his perhaps rather distinguishing eye, the most prominent thing about the gamesters appeared to be their weapons. On several of the tables were piles of silver, Mexican pesos, as large and high as the crown of his hat. There were also piles of gold and silver and United States coin. Dwayne needed no experienced eyes to see that betting was heavy and the heavy sums exchanged hands. Mexicans showed a sterner obsession and an intenser passion. Some of the Americans staked freely, nonchalantly, as befitted men to whom money was nothing. These latter were manifestly winning, for there were brother outlaws there who wagered coin with grudging, sullen, greedy eyes. Boisterous talk and laughter among the drinking men drowned, except at intervals, the low, brief talk of the gamblers. The clink of coin sounded incessantly, sometimes just low, steady, musical rings, and again, when a pile was tumbled quickly, there was a silvery crash. Here an outlaw pounded on a table with the butt of his gun. There another noisily palmed a roll of dollars, while he studied his opponent's face. The noises, however, in Benson's den did not contribute to any extent to the sinister aspect of this place. That seemed to come from the grim and reckless faces, from the bent, intent heads, from the dark lights and shades. There were bright lights, but these served only to make the shadows, and in the shadows lurked unrestrained lust of gain and spirit ruthless and reckless. A something at once suggested lawlessness, theft, murder, and hell. "Bland's not here tonight," Euchre was saying. "He left today on one of his trips, taking Alloway and some of the others, but his other man, Rugg, is here. See him standing with them three fellers, all close to Benson. Rug's the little bow-legged man with half of his face shot off. He's one-eyed, but he can sure see out of the one he's got, and darn me, there's no Hardin. You know him? He's got an outlaw gang as big as Bland's. Hardin is standing next to Benson. See how quiet and unassuming he looks? Yes, that's Hardin. He comes here once in a while to see Bland. They're friends, which sure is strange. Do you see the greaser there? The one gold and lace on his sombrero? That's Manuel, a Mexican bandit. He's a great gambler. Comes here often to drop his coin. Next to him is Bill Maher, the feller with the bandana around his head. Bill rode in the other day with some fresh bullet holes. He's been shot more than any feller I ever heard of. He's full of lead. Funny, because Bill's no trouble hunter, and like me, he'd rather run than shoot. But he's the best rustler Bland's got, a grand rider, and a wonder with the cattle. And see the tow-headed youngster? That's Kid Fuller, the kid of Bland's gang. Fuller's hit the place hard, and he won't last a year out on the border. He's killed his sweetheart's father, got a run out of Stacytown, took to stealing horses, and next he's here with Bland. Another boy gone wrong, and now sure a hard nut. Euchre went on calling Dwayne's attention to the other men just as he happened to glance over them. Any one of them would have been marked man in a respectable crowd. Here, each took his place with more or less distinction. According to the record of his past wild prowesses and his present possibilities, Dwayne, realizing that he was tolerated here, received in careless friendly spirit by this terrible class of outcasts, experienced a feeling of revulsion that amounted to almost horror. Was his being there not an ugly dream? What did he have in common with such ruffians? Then a flash memory came of painful proof. He was a criminal in sight of the Texas law. He, too, was an outcast. For the moment, Dwayne was wrapped up in painful reflections, but Euchre's heavy hand, clapping with a warning hold in his arm, brought him back to outside things. The hum of voices, the clink of coin, the loud laughter had ceased. There was a silence that manifestly had followed some unusual word or action sufficient to the still room. It was broken by a harsh curse and scrape of the bench on the floor. Some man had risen. "You stacked the cards. Did you say that?" "Twice," another voice replied, so different in its cool, ominous tone from the other. "I'll say it twice," returned the first gamester in hot haste. "I'll say it 3 times. I'll whistle it. Are you deaf?" "You light-fingered gent, you stacked the cards." Silence ensued, deeper than before, pregnant with meaning. For all that Dwayne saw, not an outlaw moved for a moment. Then suddenly the room was full of disorder as men rose and ran and dived everywhere. "Run and duck," yelled Euchre close to Dwayne's ear. With that he dashed for the door, and Dwayne leapt after him. They ran into a jostling mob. Heavy gunshots and hoarse yells hurried the crowd. Dwayne was with pell-mell out into the darkness. There they halted, and several peeped in at the door. "Who was that kid calling?" asked the outlaw. "Bud Marsh," replied another. "Reckon them first shot was Bud's. Adios, kid." It was coming to him. Went on yet another. "How many shots?" 3 or 4, I counted. 3 heavy and 1 light. That light one was the kid's .38. Listen, there's a kid hollering now. He ain't cashed in anyway. At this juncture, most of the outlaws began to file back into the room. Dwayne thought he had seen and heard enough in Benson's den for one night, and he started slowly down the walk. Presently, Euchre caught up with him. "Nobody hurt much, was sure some strange," he said. "The kid, the young Fuller that I was telling you about, he was drinking and losing, lost his nut. Calling Bud Marsh that way. Bud's as straight at cards as any of them. Somebody grabbed Bud and shot into the roof, and Fuller's arm was knocked up. He only hit the greaser." The next morning, Dwayne found that a moody and despondent spell had fastened on to him. Wishing to be alone, he went out and walked a trail leading down to the river bluff. He thought and thought. After a while, he made out that the trouble with him probably was that he could not resign himself to his fate. He had mourned the possibility chance seemed to hold in store for him. He could not believe there was no hope, but what to do appeared beyond his power to tell. Duane had intelligence and keenness enough to see his peril, the danger threatening his character as a man, such as much as that would threaten his life. He cared vastly more, he discovered, for what he considered honor and integrity that he did for life. He saw that it was bad for him to be alone, but it appeared lonely months and perhaps years inevitable must be his. Another thing puzzled him. In the bright light of day, he could not recall the state of mind that was his twilight at dusk or dark at night. By day, these visitations became to him what they really were, phantoms of his conscience. He could not dismiss the thought of them then. He could scarcely remember or believe that this strange feat or fancy of imagination had troubled him, pained him, made him sleepless and sick. That morning, Duane spent an unhappy hour wrestling his decision out of the unstable condition of his mind, but at length he determined to create interest in all that he came across and so forget himself as much as possible. He had an opportunity now to see just what the outlaw life really was. He meant to force himself to be curious, sympathetic, clear-sighted, and he would stay there in the valley until its possibilities had been exhausted or until circumstances sent him out upon his uncertain way. When he returned to the shack, Euchre was cooking dinner. "Say, Buck, I got news for you," he said, and his tone conveyed either pride in his possession of such news or pride in Duane. "Fuller named Bradley rode in this morning. He's heard something about you, told about the ace of spades they put over the bullet holes and the cowpuncher bane that you plugged. Then there was a rancher shot at a waterhole 20 miles south of Wellston. Reckon you didn't do it." "Nope, I certainly did not." "Well, you get the blame. It ain't nothing for a feller to be saddled with gun plays he never made, and, Buck, if you ever get famous, as seems likely, you'll be blamed for many crimes. The board will make an outlaw and murderer out of you." "Well, that's enough of that. I've more news. You're going to be popular." "Popular? What do you mean?" "I met Bland's wife this morning. She seen you the other day when you rode in. She sure wants to meet you. And so do some of the other women in camp. They always want to meet the new fellers who just come in. It's lonesome for women here, and they like to hear news from the towns." "Well, Euchre, I don't want to be impolite, but I'd rather not meet any of them women," rejoined Duane. "I was afraid you wouldn't. Don't blame me much. Women are hell. I was hoping, though, you might talk a little to the poor lonesome kid." "What kid?" inquired Duane, surprised. "Didn't I tell you about Jenny, the girl Bland's holding here, the one Jackrabbit Benson had a hand in stealing?" "You mentioned a girl, that's all. Tell me now," Duane replied abruptly. "Well, I got it this way. Maybe it's straight, maybe it ain't. Some years ago, Benson made a trip over the river to buy some mescal and other drinks. He'll sneak over there once in a while, and as I get it, he run across a gang of greasers with some gringo prisoners. I don't know, but I reckon there was some bartering, perhaps murdering. Anyway, Benson fetched the girl back. She was more dead than alive, but it turned out she was only starved and scared half to death. She hadn't been harmed. I reckon she was then about 14-year-old. Benson's idea, he said, was to use her in his den selling drinks and the like, but I never went much on Jackrabbit's word. Bland seen the kid right off and took to her, bought her from Benson. You can gamble, Bland. Didn't do that for notions of chivalry. It ain't gainsaying, however, but Jenny was better off with Kate Bland. She's been hard on Jenny, but she's kept Bland and the other men from treating the kid shameful like. Late Jenny has growed into an all-fired pretty girl, and Kate is powerful jealous of her. I can see hell brewing over there in Bland's cabin. That's why I wish you'd come over with me. Bland's hardly ever home. His wife's invited you, sure. She gets sweet on you as she has on Wall. That'd be complicated matters. But you get to see Jenny and maybe you could help her. Mind, I ain't hitting nothing. I'm just wanting to put her in your way. You're a man and can think for yourself. I had a baby girl once, and she lived. She'd be as big as Jenny now. By God, I wouldn't want her in Bland's camp. I'll go, Euchre. Take me over, replied Duane. He felt Euchre's eyes upon him. The old outlaw, however, had no more to say. In the afternoon, Euchre set off with Duane, and soon they reached Bland's cabin. Duane remembered it was the one where he had seen the pretty woman watching him ride by. He could not recall what she looked like. The cabin was the same as the other adobe structures in the valley, but it was larger and pleasantly located rather high up on a grove of cottonwoods. In the windows and upon the porch were evidence of a woman's hand. Through the open door, Duane caught a glimpse of bright Mexican blankets and rugs. Euchre knocked upon the side of the door. "Is that you, Euchre?" asked a girl's voice, low, hesitating. The tone of it rather deep, and with a note of fear struck Duane. He wondered what she would be like. "Yes, it's me, Jenny. Where's Mr. Bland?" answered Euchre. "She went over to Degger's. There's somebody sick," replied the girl. Euchre turned and whispered something about luck. The snap of the outlaw's eyes was added significance to Duane. "Jenny, come out or let us come in. Here's the young man I was telling you about," Euchre said. "Oh, I can't. I look so. Never mind how you look," interrupted the outlaw in a whisper. "It ain't no time to care for that. Here's young Duane, Jenny. He's no rustler, no thief. He's different. Come out, Jenny. Maybe he'll—" Euchre did not complete his sentence. He had spoken low, with his glance shifting from side to side, but what he said was sufficient to bring the girl quickly. She appeared in the doorway with downcast eyes and a stain of red in her white cheeks. She had a pretty sad face and bright hair. "Don't be shameful, Jenny," said Euchre. "You and Duane have a chance to talk a little. Now I'll go fetch Mrs. Bland, but I won't be hurrying." With that, Euchre went away through the cottonwoods. "Glad to meet you, Miss Jenny," said Duane. "Euchre didn't mention your last name. He asked me to come over to—" Duane's attempt at pleasantly was halted short when Jenny lifted her lashes to look at him. Some kind of shock went through Duane. Her gray eyes were beautiful, but it had been beauty that cut short his speech. He seemed to see a tragic struggle between hope and doubt that shone in her piercing gaze. She kept looking, and Duane could not break the silence. It was no ordinary moment. "What'd you come here for?" she asked at last. "To see you," replied Duane, glad to speak. "Why?" "Well, Euchre thought he wanted me to talk to you, cheer you up a bit," replied Duane, somewhat lamely. The earnest eyes embarrassed him. "Euchre's good. He's the only person in this awful place been good to me, but he's afraid of Bland. He said you were different. Who are you?" Duane told her. "You're not a robber, or rustler, or murderer, or some bad men come here to hide." "No, I'm not," replied Duane, trying to smile. "Then why are you here?" "I'm on the dodge. You know what that means. I got into a shooting scrape at home and had to run off. When it blows over, I hope to go back." "But you can't be honest here?" "Yeah, I can." "Oh, I know what these outlaws are. Yes, you're different." She kept a strained gaze upon him, but hope was kindling, and hard lines of her youthful face were softening. Something sweet and warm stirred deep in Duane. He realized the unfortunate girl was experiencing a birth of trust in him. "Oh, God, maybe you're the man to save me. Take me away before it's too late." Duane's spirit leaped. "Maybe I am," he replied instantly. She seemed to check a blind impulse to run into his arms. Her cheek flamed, her lips quivered, her bosom swelled under her ragged dress, and then the glow began to fade. Once more assailed her. "It can't be. You're only after me, too. Like Bland, like all of them." Duane's long arms went out and his hands clasped onto her shoulders. He shook her. "Look at me straight in the eye. There are decent men. Haven't you a father? A brother?" "They're all dead. Killed by raiders. We lived in Dimmitt County. I was carried away," Jenny replied hurriedly. She put up an appealing hand to him. "Forgive me. I believe I know you're good. It was only I live in so much fear. I'm half crazy. I've almost forgotten what good men are like, Mr. Duane. You'll help me?" "Yes, Jenny, I will. Tell me how. What must I do? Have you any plan?" "Oh, no, but take me away." "I'll try," said Duane simply. "That won't be easy, though. I must have time to think. You must help me. There are many things to consider: horses, food, trails, and the best time to make the attempt. Are you watched? Are you kept prisoner?" "No. I could have run off lots of times, but I was afraid I'd only fallen into worse hands. Euchre's told me that. Mrs. Bland beats me, half starves me, but she's kept me from her husband and those other dogs. She's been as good as that, and I'm grateful. She hasn't done it for love of me, though. She's always hated me, and lately is growing jealous. There was a man came here by the name of Spence, so he called himself. He tried to be kind to me, but she wouldn't let him. She was in love with him. She's a bad woman. Bland finally shot Spence, and that ended that. She's been jealous ever since. I hear her fighting with Bland about me. She swears she'll kill me before he gets me, and Bland laughs in her face. Then I've heard Chess Alloway try to persuade Bland to give me to him, but Bland doesn't laugh then. Just lately, before Bland went away, things almost came to a head. I couldn't sleep. I wish Mrs. Bland would kill me. I certainly kill myself if they ruin me. Duane, you must be quick if you're going to save me." "I realize that," he replied thoughtfully. "I think my difficulty would be fool Mrs. Bland. If she suspected me, she'd have the whole gang of outlaws on me at once." "She would at that. You got to be careful and quick." "What kind of woman is she?" inquired Duane. "She's brazen. I've heard her with her lovers. They get drunk sometimes when Bland's away, and she's got a temper. She's vain. She likes flattery." "Oh, you could fool her easy enough if you lower yourself to, You mean to make love to her?" interrupted Duane. Jenny bravely turned her shamed eyes to meet his. "My girl, I'd do worse than that to get you away from her," he said bluntly. "But Duane," she faltered, and again she put out her appealing hand, "Bland will kill you." Duane made no reply to this. He was trying to still rising a strange tumult in his breast, the old emotion, the rush of instinct to kill. He turned cold all over. "Chess Holloway will kill you if Bland doesn't," went on Jenny, with her tragic eyes on Duane's. "Maybe he will," replied Duane. It was difficult for him to force a smile, but he achieved one. "Oh, better take me off at once," she said. "Save me without risking so much, without having to make love to Mrs. Bland. Surely, if I can, there. I see Euchre coming with a woman. That's her. Oh, she mustn't see me with you." "Wait a moment," whispered Duane, as Jenny slipped indoors. "We settled it. Don't forget. I'll find some way to get word to you, perhaps through Euchre. Meanwhile, keep up your courage. Remember, I'll save you somehow. Well, strategy first. Whatever you see or hear me do, don't think less of me." Jenny checked him with a gesture and a wonderful gray flash of her eyes. "I bless you with every drop of blood in my heart," she whispered passionately. It was only as she turned into the room that Duane saw she was lame and that she wore Mexican sandals over bare feet. He sat down upon a bench on the porch and directed his attention to the approaching couple. The trees of the grove were thick enough for him to make reasonably sure that Mrs. Bland had not seen him talking to Jenny. When the outlaw's wife drew near, Duane saw that she was a tall, strong, full-bodied woman, rather good-looking, with a full-blown, bold attractiveness. Duane was more concerned with her expression than with her good looks, and as she appeared unsuspicious, he felt relieved. The situation then took on a singular zest. Euchre came up on the porch and awkwardly introduced Duane to Mrs. Bland. She was young, probably not over 25, and not quite so prepossessing at close range. Her eyes were large, rather prominent, and brown in color. Her mouth, too, was large, with full lips, and she had white teeth. Duane took her proffered hand and remarked frankly that he was glad to meet her. Mrs. Bland appeared pleased, and her laugh, which followed, was loud and rather musical. Mr. Duane, Buck Duane, Euchre said. Didn't he? She asked. Buckley, corrected Duane. Nickname's not of my choosing. I'm certain glad to meet you, Buckley Duane, she said, as she took the seat Duane offered her. Sorry to have been out. Kid Fuller's lying over at Daggers, you know. He was shot last night. He's got a fever today. When Bland's away, I have to nurse all these shot-up boys, and it sure takes up my time. Have you been waiting here alone? Didn't see that slattern girl of mine, have you? She gave him a sharp glance. The woman had an extraordinary play of feature, Duane thought, and unless she was smiling, she wasn't pretty at all. I've been alone, replied Duane. Haven't seen anybody but a sick-looking girl with a bucket, and she ran when she saw me. That was Jen, said Mrs. Bland. She's the kid we keep here, and she sure hardly pays her keep. Did Euchre tell you about her? Now that I think of it, he did say something of that order. What did he tell you about me? Bluntly asked Mrs. Bland. Well, Kate, replied Euchre, speaking for himself, you needn't worry none. If I told Buck nothing but compliments. Evidently the outlaw wife liked Euchre, for her keen glance rested with amusement upon him. As for Jen, I'll tell you her story some day, went on the woman. It's a common enough story along this river. Euchre here is a tender-hearted old fool, and Jen is taken to him. Well, seeing as you got me figured correct, replied Euchre dryly, I'll go in and talk to Jenny, if I may. Certainly. Go ahead. Jen calls you her best friend, said Mrs. Bland amiably. You're always fetching some Mexican stuff, and that's why, I guess. When Euchre shuffled into the house, Mrs. Bland turned to Duane with curiosity and interest in her gaze. Bland told me about you. What'd he say? Queried Duane in a pretended alarm. Oh, you needn't think he's done you dirt. Bland's not that kind of man. He said, Kate, there's a young fellow in camp, rode in here on the Dodge. He's no criminal, and he refused to join my band. Wish he would. Slickest hand with a gun I seen for many a day. And I'd like to see him and Chess meet out there on the road. Then Bland went on to tell how you and Bossmer came together. What'd he say? Inquired Dane, and she paused. Me? Why, I asked him what you looked like, she replied gaily. Well, went on Duane, magnificent chap, Bland said. Bigger than any man in the valley, just a great blue-eyed sunburned boy. Huh, exclaimed Duane. I'm sorry he led you to expect somebody worth seeing. Oh, but I'm not disappointed, she returned archly. Duane, you're going to stay here long in camp? Yes, I'll run out of money and we have to move. Why? Mrs. Bland's face underwent one of those singular changes, of smiles and flushes and glances. All that had been coquettish about her had lent her a certain attractiveness, almost beauty and youth. But with some powerful emotion she changed instantly and became a woman of discontent. Duane imagined of deep and violent nature. I'll tell you, Duane, she said earnestly. I'm sure glad if you mean to bide here a while. I'm a miserable woman, Duane. I'm an outlaw's wife, and I hate him and the life I have to lead. I come of good family in Brownsville. Never knew Bland was an outlaw till long after he married me. We were separated at times, and I imagined he was away on business, but truth came out. Bland shot my own cousin, who told me. My family cast me off, and I had to flee with Bland. I was only 18. I lived here ever since, and never seen a decent woman or man. I never hear anything about my old home or folks or friends. I'm buried here, buried alive with a lot of thieves and murderers. Can you blame me for being glad to see a young fellow, a gentleman, like the boys I used to go with? I tell you, it makes me feel full. I want to cry. I'm sick for somebody to talk to. I have no children, thank God. If I had, I'd not stay here. I'm sick of this hole. I'm lonely. There appeared to be no doubt about the truth of all this. Genuine emotion checked, then halted the hurried speech. She broke down and cried. It seemed strange to Duane that an outlaw's wife and a woman who fitted her consort and the wild nature of their surroundings should have weakness enough to weep. Duane believed and pitied her. I'm sorry for you, he said. Don't be sorry for me, she said. That only makes me see the difference between you and me. And don't pay any attention to what these outlaws say about me. They're ignorant. They couldn't understand me. You hear that Bland killed man who ran after me, but that's a lie. Bland, like all other outlaws along this river, is always looking for somebody to kill. He swears not, but I don't believe him. He explains that gunplay gravitates to men who are the real thing, that's provoked by the four flashes and bad men. I don't know. All I know is that somebody's being killed every other day. He hated Spence before Spence even saw me. Would Bland object if I called on you occasionally? Inquired Dwayne. No, he wouldn't. He likes me to have friends. Ask himself when he comes back. Trouble has been that 2 or 3 of his men fell in love with me, and when they're half drunk got to fighting. You're not going to do that. I'm not going to get half drunk, that's certain, replied Dwayne. He was surprised to see her eyes dilate, then glow with fire. Be sure she could reply to Euchre, returned to the porch, and put an end to the conversation. Dwayne was content to let the matter rest there and had little more to say. Euchre and Mrs. Bland joked while Dwayne listened. He tried to form some estimate of her character. Manifestly, she had suffered a wrong, if not worse, at Bland's hand. She was bitter, morbid, over-emotional. If she was a liar, which seemed likely enough, she was a frank one and believed herself. She had no cunning. The thing which struck Dwayne so forcibly was that she thirsted for respect. In that, better than in her weakness of vanity, he thought he had discovered a trait through which he could manage her. Once, while he was revolving these thoughts, he happened to glance into the house, and deep in the shadow of a corner he caught a pale gleam of Jenny's face with great eyes staring on him. She had been watching him, listening to what he said. He saw from her expression that she had realized what had been so hard for her to believe. Watching his chance, he flashed a look at her, and then it seemed to him the change in her face was wonderful. Later, after he left Mrs. Bland with a meaning adios mañana, and was walking along beside the old outlaw, he found himself thinking of the girl instead of the woman, and of how he had seen her face blaze with hope and gratitude.